The earth had forgotten what water looked like. 100 days without rain had turned the land into something closer to bone than soil. Silas Everhart stood at the edge of his empty water barrel, staring at the rust-stained bottom where nothing remained but dried mud and the memory of better times. He had 2 cannons left, 2 metal containers that held maybe 3 days of life between them, if he rationed carefully and didn't move much. But the rancher knew something the desert always made clear. You don't bargain with thirst. You either have water or you have a grave. The morning sun climbed over the ridge like it was angry at the world. Silas wiped his cracked lips with the back of his hand, tasted copper, and turned toward the fence line where his last 5 cattle had collapsed 2 days ago. He hadn't bothered burying them. The ground was too hard, and his strength was too thin. The land would take them back eventually, the way it took everything else. His hands shook as he lifted one of the cannons from the table inside his cabin. The weight of it felt both heavy and not nearly heavy enough. 3 years ago, his wife Martha had died in the bedroom just beyond the kitchen, and he'd stayed because leaving felt like betraying her memory. Now he wondered if staying had been the slowest way to follow her. He uncapped the canteen and allowed himself 3 small sips. The water was warm, tasted like metal, but it was life. He capped it again and set it down with the same care a man might handle something sacred. Because out here, in a land that had turned hostile, water was the only religion that mattered. Silas walked outside, his boots crunching against earth so dry it sounded like breaking glass. The sky stretched endless and merciless above him. Not a single cloud to suggest hope. He'd lived on this ranch for 42 years, watched his wife's garden bloom every spring, raised cattle that once numbered in the hundreds, built a life from nothing but sweat and determination. Now he watched it all die, piece by piece, while he counted down his final days and ounces of water. The wind carried dust and heat, nothing else, no bird song, no rustle of grass. Even the insects had abandoned this place. Silas leaned against the fence post, the wood so dry it felt like it might crumble under his weight, and stared at the horizon where the land blurred into sky. He thought about the letters he'd never written to his brother in the Eastern Territories, the grandchildren he'd never meet. The fact that when he died out here, it might be weeks before anyone found him. But what caught his attention wasn't the landscape of death surrounding him. It was movement near the southern fence, something low to the ground, something that shouldn't be there. Silas squinted against the glare, his heart picking up speed despite his exhaustion. Something was lying in the dirt about 50 yards out, partially hidden by the shadow of a scraggly bush that had somehow refused to die. He grabbed the second canteen from inside. He wasn't sure why, and started walking toward whatever had collapsed on his land. Each step felt like it cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. As he got closer, his breath caught in his chest. It wasn't an animal, it was a girl. And from the way she was dressed, from the long dark hair spread around her head like a dark halo against the pale earth, he knew exactly what she was. An Apache child, maybe 10 or 12 years old, and she wasn't moving. Silas dropped to his knees beside the girl, his joints protesting the sudden movement. Her skin was the color of copper left too long in the sun, lips cracked and bleeding, chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate breaths. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck and felt a pulse, weak, irregular, but there she was alive, barely. Dust covered her clothes, and her hair was tangled with bits of dry brush. She'd been walking for a long time, probably got separated from her people during one of the dust storms that had been rolling through the territory for weeks. Her hands were scraped raw, fingernails broken. She'd been crawling before she collapsed. Silas looked back toward his cabin, then down at the girl, then at the canteen in his hand. The mathematics of survival played out in his head with brutal clarity. He had maybe 72 hours of life left with 2 cans. The girl needed water immediately or she'd be dead by nightfall. If he gave her 1 canteen, he'd have 36 hours, maybe less if the heat kept climbing. His wife's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd said years ago when he'd refused to help a drifter who'd shown up half-starved at their door. The measure of a man isn't what he does when it costs him nothing. It's what he does when it costs him everything. He thought that was naive at the time. Out here, sentiment got you killed. But Martha had insisted, and they'd fed the drifter, and the man had moved on, and nothing bad had happened. Nothing good either. Just another day in a long string of days. But this wasn't about philosophy or memories. This was about a child dying in front of him while he had the means to stop it. He uncapped the first canteen, the one he'd already drunk from, and tilted it toward the girl's mouth. Her lips were so dry, they stuck together. He used his thumb to separate them gently, the way he'd once done for newborn calves that couldn't figure out how to drink. Water touched her tongue and her eyes snapped open, dark brown, wide with fear and confusion. She choked, tried to pull away, but Silas held the canteen steady. "Easy, you need this." She didn't understand English, but his tone must have carried meaning because she stopped fighting and drank. Not gulping, not desperate, just steady pulls that told him she'd known real thirst before. When half the canteen was gone, Silas pulled it back. She reached for it, fingers clawing air, but he shook his head. "That's all for now. Too much will make you sick." He helped her sit up. She swayed, would have fallen if he hadn't caught her shoulder. Her eyes fixed on the canteen in his hand, then moved to his face, then back to the canteen. There was something in that look. He recognized the desperate calculation of someone measuring their odds of survival. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Silas caught her again, felt how light she was, nothing but bones and determination. He looked at the cabin, then at the sun climbing higher, then at the half-empty canteen. The girl needed more water, needed shelter, needed care he wasn't sure he had the strength to provide. But the bigger problem was simple and terrible. Half a canteen wasn't going to save her. She was too far gone. He'd need to give her more, maybe all of what remained in the first canteen. And then there would only be one left. One canteen for one man in a land that showed no mercy to anyone. The girl's hand closed weakly around his wrist, and she looked at him with eyes that held no expectation of kindness. She'd already accepted death. He could see it in the way she held herself, the resignation of someone too young to have learned it. Silas stood pulling her up with him. She weighed almost nothing. He started walking back toward the cabin, the girl leaning heavily against his side, each step requiring more effort than the last. The canteen hung from his other hand, half full of water that was supposed to keep him alive. He didn't let himself think about what happened after she recovered enough to walk. Didn't let himself think about the tribe that would come looking for her. Didn't let himself think about anything except the shade of the cabin and the other canteen waiting on the table. One canteen left, and a choice that hadn't even finished revealing itself yet. Inside the cabin, Silas lowered the girl onto the floor near the wall where the shade was deepest. She slumped against the weathered wood, eyes half closed, breathing still shallow. He set the half-empty canteen on the table next to the full one, and stood there staring at both of them like they were judges waiting to deliver a sentence. The girl made a sound, barely more than a whisper. When he looked at her, she was pointing at the cantons with a trembling hand. Her meaning was clear enough, more, She needed more. Silas picked up the half-empty canteen and brought it to her. She drank the rest in long, steady pulls, and when it was empty, she looked at him again, still thirsty, still dying, just slower now. He knew the signs. He'd seen cattle die of thirst, watched men stumble into town barely alive after getting lost in the territory. The body needed time to absorb water, needed rest, needed more than what he'd given her. Half a canteen would keep her breathing for a few more hours, maybe through the night if she was strong. But by morning, without more water, she'd be right back where he found her. The second canteen sat on the table like an accusation, full, heavy, his last chance at living long enough to see rain, if rain ever came again. He'd rationed carefully for weeks, watching his reserves shrink from barrels to buckets to this one metal container that held maybe 36 hours of existence. Martha's grave was out back, marked by stones he'd carried from the creek bed before it dried up. He'd sat beside it for hours after she died, asking questions that had no answers. One of those questions had been whether he'd have the courage to follow her when his time came, or whether he'd fight like a cornered animal to squeeze out every last day of life. Now he knew the answer. Silas picked up the second canteen, uncapped it, and knelt beside the girl. Her eyes widened when she saw what he was holding. She shook her head, tried to push his hand away, but she didn't have the strength. She understood what this meant. Somehow, despite the language barrier, despite being a child, she understood he was choosing her life over his own. "Drink," he said, and held the canteen to her lips. She drank, not as desperately this time, but with something that looked like tears mixing with the water running down her chin. When she'd taken enough that her breathing steadied, when color started returning to her face, Silas capped the canteen and set it aside. Maybe a quarter of it remained, enough for one more day if he was careful. If he didn't move much, if the temperature didn't climb higher. The girl's hand found his, her fingers wrapping around his palm. She looked at him with eyes that held something beyond gratitude. Recognition, maybe, or the kind of debt that couldn't be measured in words. She wore a small necklace made of beads and animal bones. With shaking hands, she removed it and pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it. He tried to give it back, but she wouldn't take it. She held his fist closed around the necklace and nodded once, firm and certain. Whatever this meant in her world, it was important. They sat like that until the worst heat of the day passed. A return to something close to normal, until her eyes cleared enough that he could see intelligence and awareness behind them. She was going to live for now. As evening came and the temperature finally dropped below unbearable, the girl stood. Her legs held this time. She looked at Silas, then at the door, then back at Silas. She pointed to the horizon, to the south, where the Badlands stretched for miles. "Your people," he said, knowing she couldn't understand, but needing to say it anyway. "You need to find your people." She nodded. She understood that much at least. She took one step toward the door, then turned back and touched her hand to her heart, then pointed at him. Whatever language her people spoke, that gesture needed no translation. Then she walked out of the cabin and into the evening heat. Silas watched from the doorway as she moved across his land, stronger now, but still unsteady, heading toward the southern ridge. He watched until she disappeared over the rise, swallowed by the landscape that had nearly killed her. When she was gone, he went back inside and looked at the quarter canteen of water sitting on his table. He'd saved her life and signed his own death warrant. The mathematics were simple and final. He had maybe one day left, maybe less. Silas sat at his table as darkness filled the cabin, the quarter canteen in front of him, catching what little moonlight came through the window. He'd allowed himself 3 small sips throughout the evening. Each one felt like borrowing time he didn't have. The water was warm, tasted metallic, but it kept his throat from closing completely. His hands shook when he lifted the canteen. Not from fear exactly, but from the body's recognition that it was shutting down. He'd seen this before in animals. The tremors that came when the flesh understood what the mind was trying to deny. He was dying, not tomorrow or the next day. The process had already started. Cells crying out for moisture that wouldn't come. He thought about writing letters, but his hand cramped too badly to hold a pen. Thought about walking to Martha's grave, but wasn't sure he'd have the strength to walk back. So he sat in the chair he'd built 30 years ago and watched shadows move across walls he'd raised with his own hands. The necklace the girl had given him lay on the table beside the canteen. Animal bones and colored beads strung on what looked like horsehair. He picked it up, felt the weight of it, wondered what it meant in her world. A promise, maybe a marker of debt, or just the only thing she had to offer. It didn't matter now. She was gone, hopefully found by her people, hopefully alive. That was enough. It had to be enough. The night grew colder, which was mercy of a kind. Heat killed faster than cold. Silas wrapped himself in a blanket that smelled like dust and age, and closed his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come easily. The body fought too hard when it was dying, but exhaustion was its own kind of weight. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Never quite asleep, but never fully awake either. Dreams mixed with memories, mixed with hallucinations born from dehydration. He saw Martha in the kitchen, young again, laughing at something he'd said. Saw the ranch as it had been 20 years ago, green and alive. Cattle moving across hills thick with grass. Saw water flowing in the creek. Heard it bubbling over stones that were now nothing but baked mud. When the dreams turned darker, when he saw the empty barrels and dead animals and land turning to dust, he forced his eyes open. The cabin was still there, still real, still his tomb. The quarter canteen seemed lighter than before. He picked it up, shook it gently, heard the water slosh. Maybe a few more hours of liquid. Maybe enough to see one more sunrise. That felt important somehow. To see the sun come up one last time over land he'd loved and hated in equal measure. He uncapped the canteen and allowed himself another small sip. The water barely wet his mouth. His tongue was swollen, lips cracked so badly they bled when he moved them. He kept the canteen again and set it down with the care of someone handling something sacred. Then he closed his eyes and waited for morning or for whatever came after living. When living finally ran out of reasons to continue, the hours passed like stones sinking through mud. Slow, heavy, inevitable. Sometimes he jolted awake at sounds that weren't there. Sometimes he felt Martha's hand on his shoulder, turned to look, found only empty air. The body played tricks when it was dying. The mind invented comfort where none existed. But as the darkness began to thin at the edges, as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Silas heard something that wasn't imagined. Something real and impossible and terrifying all at once. Horses, dozens of them, maybe more. The sound of hooves on hard earth getting closer, coming from the south where the girl had disappeared hours before. His eyes opened, his heart, weak and struggling, suddenly found reason to beat faster. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He gripped the table edge and pulled himself up, the room spinning, and stumbled toward the window. What he saw in the preed, on-light made his breath catch in his chest. They were everywhere. Riders covered the hills like shadows given form. Not dozens, hundreds. They lined the ridges to the east and west, filled the valley to the south, their horses standing motionless in the gray morning light. Apache warriors, every one of them sitting in perfect silence, as if they'd been carved from the same stone as the land itself. Silas gripped the window frame to keep from falling. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. 300 people, maybe more, arranged in a massive circle with his cabin at the center. They weren't moving, weren't speaking, just watching with a patience that felt older than the territory itself. Terror moved through him like ice water. He'd heard stories his whole life. Settlers massacred, ranches burned, entire families wiped out in a single night. The Apache were fierce when they needed to be, protective of their land, unforgiving of trespass. And he'd taken one of their children, fed her, sent her back. But maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe they'd come for payment of a different kind. He looked at the quarter canteen on the table, at the necklace beside it, at his rifle leaning against the wall. The gun was useless. Even if he had the strength to lift it, even if he could fire it, what would one bullet do against 300 warriors? He'd die either way. The only question was whether it would be from thirst or from something faster. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, painting the riders in shades of copper and gold. Silas could see them clearly now. Men of different ages, some young and lean, others broader with the bearing of experience. They wore traditional clothing, carried weapons, sat their horses with the ease of people born to the saddle. Not a single one looked hostile. Not a single one looked friendly either. They just looked present, like forces of nature, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Silas forced himself to move away from the window. If they wanted him dead, hiding inside wouldn't change anything. If they wanted something else, answers, revenge, justice for whatever they thought he'd done, then facing them like a coward wouldn't help. He picked up the necklace the girl had given him, hung it around his neck, and tucked it inside his shirt. Maybe it would mean something to them. Maybe they'd understand he'd tried to help, or maybe they'd see it as theft. One more crime added to whatever list they were keeping. His legs barely supported his weight as he walked to the door. Each step cost him something he didn't have to give, but he kept moving. He pushed the door open and stepped into the morning light, squinting against the brightness, his body swaying like grass and wind. The riders remained motionless, hundreds of eyes fixed on him, measuring him, judging something he couldn't name. The silence was absolute. No hoof beats, no voices, not even the sound of leather creaking. Just stillness so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Silas took 3 steps from his porch before his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, too weak to stand, too stubborn to lie down completely. He lifted his head and looked at the closest riders, maybe 30 yards away. One of them, a man older than the others with gray streaking through his hair, nudged his horse forward. The horse walked slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between them. The rider's face was weathered, marked by sun and wind, and years of living in land that demanded everything. His eyes were dark and unreadable. When he was close enough that Silas could hear the horse breathing, the man stopped. He looked down at Silas for a long moment. Then his gaze moved to the cabin behind him, to the land stretching dead and broken in every direction, to the empty water barrels visible near the side of the house. His eyes came back to Silas, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding, or judgment finally reached. The man dismounted in one smooth motion and walked forward until he stood directly in front of Silas. He was tall, broad-shouldered, carried himself with authority that needed no announcement. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled something out. A small piece of beaded necklace, the same pattern as the one the girl had given Silas, the same colors, the same design. The man held it up so Silas could see it clearly. Then he pointed at Silas at the necklace hidden under his shirt and nodded once. He knew he understood, and whatever was about to happen next, it started with that understanding. The Apache leader knelt in the dirt beside Silas, bringing himself to eye level. Up close, Silas could see the lines carved deep into the man's face, the scar running along his jaw, the intelligence behind eyes that had seen more than most men would in 3 lifetimes. This wasn't someone who acted without thought. This was someone who measured every decision against consequences that rippled far beyond the moment. The man reached forward slowly, giving Silas time to pull away if he wanted. When Silas didn't move, the leader's hand went to the necklace hanging around Silas's neck, pulling it out from under his shirt. He held it carefully, studying the pattern of beads and bones, then looked back at his own piece. His thumb traced the design with something that looked like reverence. Then he did something Silas didn't expect. He smiled. Not broadly, not with teeth, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that carried more weight than any words could. He pressed his hand to his own chest, over his heart, then gestured to Silas, then pointed south toward where the girl had walked the night before. The meaning was clear enough. The girl had made it home. She'd survived, and this man, probably her father, judging by the way he held that necklace, knew exactly who was responsible. 2 other riders dismounted and approached, carrying something between them. A water skin, large and heavy, still dripping from the outside like it had been submerged recently. They set it down in front of Silas with the kind of care usually reserved for something precious. The leader opened it, tilted it toward Silas's face. Water, fresh water, cold water that smelled like stone and earth, and everything good that had been missing from this land for 100 days. Silas's hand shook as he reached for it. The leader helped guide it to his lips, and when the first drops hit Silas's tongue, his body nearly convulsed from the shock of it. He drank slowly, forcing himself not to gulp, knowing too much too fast would make him sick. The water was pure and clean and tasted like living. When he drank enough that his throat didn't feel like cracked leather, the leader pulled the water skin back and capped it. He said something in his own language, his tone formal and measured, like he was making a declaration. The other riders responded in unison, a single word that echoed across the valley. The leader stood and gestured toward the hills where hundreds of his people sat watching. He made a sweeping motion that included the land, the cabin, the empty barrels, everything Silas owned. Then he pointed at the ground near the house and made a digging motion with his hands. Silas's foggy mind struggled to understand. They were going to dig here. Why? But the leader wasn't finished. He called out something sharp and commanding. Immediately, riders began dismounting. Not just a few, not dozens, all of them. The entire circle of warriors swung down from their horses in synchronized motion. And suddenly, the land that had been so deadly quiet was filled with the sound of movement and purpose. They pulled tools from their saddlebags, digging implements made from wood and bone and stone. Simple but effective. They organized themselves without apparent discussion, forming groups that moved with the efficiency of people who'd worked together before. Some headed toward a spot about 20 yards from Silas's cabin. Others began clearing brush and stones. Still others formed lines to pass equipment. The leader knelt again beside Silas, this time drawing in the dirt with his finger. He sketched a circle, then drew lines going down from it. He pointed at the drawing, then at the spot where his people were gathering, then made the digging motion again. Understanding hit Silas like cold water. They weren't here for revenge. They weren't here to take anything. They were here to give something back, something that matched what he'd given the girl. Water for water. Life for life. The leader saw recognition in Silas's face and nodded. He spoke again, his words carrying weight, even though Silas couldn't understand them. But tone conveyed meaning. This was about honor, about debt, about the kind of balance that existed beyond language or culture, or the barriers people built between each other. The leader stood and joined his people at the digging site. Within minutes, they'd begun excavating the earth with a precision that spoke of knowledge Silas didn't possess. They knew something about this land that he'd missed in 42 years of living here. They knew where the water was hiding, and they'd come to help him find it. Silas watched from the shade of his porch as 300 people transformed his land. They worked in rotating groups, some digging while others rested, then switching places with a rhythm that never slowed. The sound of tools striking earth became constant, almost musical, a percussion that filled the morning air. He tried to stand and help, but the leader had firmly guided him back to sitting, pressing the water skin into his hands. Drink, rest, watch. The message was clear. This wasn't his work to do. This was theirs. The hole grew deeper as the sun climbed higher. They'd started with a wide circle, maybe 8 ft across, and dug straight down with a precision that amazed him. They didn't just throw dirt randomly. They organized it into careful piles, separating different types of soil, creating a system Silas didn't understand, but clearly served a purpose. Every hour, someone would lower a man into the hole on a rope to continue the excavation, while others hauled up baskets of earth hand over hand. The coordination was flawless. Not a single moment wasted, not a single person idle. Even the children who'd come with the adults had jobs, carrying water to the workers, tending horses, organizing tools. By mid-morning, they dug past the dry topsoil into layers that showed slightly darker earth. Silas knew what that meant. They were getting closer to where moisture might exist, down where the sun couldn't bake everything to dust. They were reaching depths he'd never had the resources or knowledge to access. The leader appeared beside Silas, offering him dried meat and more water. Silas took both, his body crying out for sustenance it hadn't received in days. As he ate, the leader pointed at the digging site and spoke in his language, his tone educational, like he was explaining something important. A younger warrior approached and spoke to Silas in broken English. "Grandfather says, Earth remembers water deep, very deep. Your people dig wide, we dig deep." Silas understood. Then, he'd been looking for water horizontally, following creek beds, expecting it to flow where it always had. They were looking vertically, going down to aquifers that existed beneath the drought, beneath the surface devastation to water that had been there long before the dry times and would remain long after. The young warrior continued translating as the leader spoke. "Grandfather says, daughter told us. Old man gave last water. Last water is sacred. Sacred water requires sacred answer." The leader placed his hand on Silas's shoulder, squeezed once, then returned to supervising the work. The digging continued without pause. 12 ft deep, 15 ft, 20 ft. The hole became so deep, they had to build a wooden frame to support the sides. Constructing it from dead trees they dragged from the surrounding land. Then just past noon, a shout went up from the diggers. The sound echoed across the valley, picked up by other voices until it became a wave of excitement. Workers crowded around the hole's edge. The man at the bottom called up, his voice urgent. They'd found mud, real mud, wet mud, which meant water was close. The digging intensified. More workers rotated in. The baskets coming up now carried earth that was damp, then soaked, then sloppy with moisture. Silas stood, despite his weakness, walked toward the hole with legs that barely supported him. and looked down into darkness that went deeper than he'd ever imagined possible. At the bottom, maybe 25 FT down, he could see it. Water. Not much yet. Just a dark pool forming at the base of the hole. But it was there, real, present. Proof that beneath all this death, life still existed if you knew where to look. The workers didn't stop. They built a stone lining along the hole's walls to prevent collapse, setting rocks with the care of people building something meant to last generations. They constructed a wooden frame at the top, strong and stable, designed to support a rope and bucket system. By late afternoon, the pool at the bottom had grown to nearly 2 FT deep. By evening, it was 4 FT and still rising. The aquifer they tapped was feeding the well steadily, water seeping through the walls and collecting in a reservoir that would never run dry as long as the earth beneath had water to give. They'd built a well, a real functioning permanent well in a single day with nothing but hand tools and knowledge and 300 people working as one. The leader stood beside Silas as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. He lowered a bucket into the well, pulled it up full, and offered it to Silas. Water clear and cold and endless, Silas drank from the bucket until his body remembered what it felt like to be human again. The water was cold and pure, tasting of stone and earth, and something ancient that had nothing to do with the drought above. He drank until his stomach protested, then sat back against the well's wooden frame and felt tears cut tracks through the dust on his face. The Apache leader watched him for a moment, then nodded with satisfaction. He called out instructions to his people, and they began organizing for departure. Tools were gathered and secured, horses were prepared, but before they left, several warriors approached carrying bundles wrapped in leather. They set them near the well. The young translator appeared again. Grandfather says, gifts for maintaining the well, for understanding what was given. Silas unwrapped the bundles with shaking hands. Inside he found rope, strong and well made, a bucket better than the one he'd owned, stone tools for clearing debris from the well, leather pouches filled with seeds, vegetables, and grains that could grow in harsh conditions. They'd thought of everything he'd need, not just to survive, but to rebuild. The girl appeared from among the crowd of people preparing to leave. She looked healthy now, her eyes bright, her movements full of the energy children possessed when they weren't dying of thirst. She walked straight to Silas and threw her arms around his neck, holding on tight enough that he felt the tremor running through her small frame. When she pulled back, her father stood beside her. The leader placed his hand on his daughter's head, then on Silas's shoulder. He spoke in his language, his voice carrying across the gathering. The young translator provided the words, "Grandfather says, you gave water when you had none to give. You chose her life over your own. This is the greatest gift one person can give another. We return the gift in the only way that honors what you did. With water that will never run dry, with life that continues long after we leave." The leader reached into his shirt and pulled out something small, another piece of the beaded necklace, this one showing a different pattern. He pressed it into Silas's hand and closed his fingers around it. "Grandfather says you are family now. This land is protected. If you need help, send word. We will come." Then the leader mounted his horse. His daughter was lifted up to ride with him, settling in front of her father with the ease of someone who'd made that journey countless times. She waved at Silas, her smile bright enough to rival the sun. The Apache people mounted their horses in the same coordinated silence they'd arrived with. They formed lines that stretched across the land. And when the leader raised his hand, they began to move. Not quickly, not slowly, just steady, purposeful, heading back toward the southern territories where they belonged. Silas stood beside his well and watched them go. 300 people who'd traveled miles to repay a debt that most would have considered already settled. 100 people who'd worked an entire day under brutal sun to dig deep enough to find water that would save a man they didn't know. As the last rider disappeared over the southern ridge, Silas turned back to his well. He lowered the bucket again, pulled up more water, and carried it to the area where Martha's garden had once flourished. He poured it onto the cracked earth, watched it soak in, darken the soil. Then he went back for more and more and more. By evening, he'd watered the entire garden plot. By the next morning, he'd filled every barrel and container on his property. By the end of the week, the earth around his cabin had started to soften. Seeds he planted began to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing through soil that had been declared dead. The land began to heal, not quickly, not dramatically, but real and steady and permanent. Silas worked his ranch through that season and the next. When rain finally returned to the territory months later, his well continued flowing. The aquifer the Apache had found ran deep and true, unaffected by surface conditions, providing water through dry times and wet times alike. He rebuilt his herd, replanted his garden, fixed fences and structures that had started to collapse. The ranch that had been dying became alive again, sustained by water that flowed from a well built by 300 hands in a single day. Years later, when travelers passed through asking for water, Silas never refused. He'd fill their cantons, provide what they needed, and send them on their way with enough to reach the next town safely. When they asked why he was so generous, he'd touch the beaded necklace he still wore and tell them a simple truth. Water given freely comes back 100-fold. Kindness shown to one person ripples across generations, and some debts are paid not with money or words, but with a kind of gift that saves lives long after the giver has gone. The well still flows, the land still lives, and Silas Everhart, the old rancher who gave his last water to a dying child, never went thirsty again. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another tale from the frontier, where courage and compassion reshape destinies in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us bring you more stories like this one. Your support means